How are you? Thanks for being here. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
I got it.
Here we go. We got. Oh, you got.
I got it.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice of you.
All right.
Thank you.
Got it.
All
I
right.
met Obama in Manchester. And, oh, wait.
This is a lucky hand. Yeah. Okay. I'm glad I got to meet you.
But I'd love to see you.
Yeah. Well, we are. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for helping us. Well, let's go do it. I think we're gonna get started this way, please. Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah. Here we go. Hi. How are you? There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Glad you made it to Kobe.
Thank you for having us out. We really appreciate it. We're excited about this. Thank you. Thanks for having us out.
I got a cold and I don't want to
Let's
give
do
you
this. Or this. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having us out. I appreciate it. Yeah. There we
I just wanted to tell you that I hope you're enjoying the weather. We wanted to give you a taste of what it's like to campaign in November, so this is a little time. I want to make sure to introduce Eric Boyer, who is from the college. Thank you very much for hosting us. Maureen Strong, Chris Mueller from the mayor from the town and the county Democratic Committee. We're so excited to have you. We're so weary of the current administration, and we want to hear what you have to offer us. So welcome. It's fabulous that you're here. Thank you.
Representative Abel, thank you for introducing us, and we're just going to get the volume down a little bit. To Colby Sawyer for hosting us today, President Stubner, who greeted us as we first came in, Chris and Maureen, who helped to make this a success, and each one of you for taking some time out of your lives to welcome a stranger from far west Texas onto this extraordinarily beautiful campus, into this library that someone was telling me is comprised of two Civil War era barns that have been joined, and it's just beautiful. And the drive-in was extraordinary. Despite the rain and the clouds and the weather, we were just in awe of what we were seeing. So unlike where Amy and I are from, the Chihuahuan Desert, where it is beautiful in its own right. And we're in the Rocky Mountains at a base elevation of 4,000 feet in El Paso, right in the Rio Grande River Valley, but missing all this green stuff that you guys have, the grass and the trees. So it's beautiful to be in your part of the world. And we bring you greetings from El Paso, Texas, with Ciudad Juarez forming the largest binational community in the Western Hemisphere. 3 million of us in that Rio Grande River Valley, from Juarez, from El Paso, coming together to form one people. And it is there that I met Amy, my wife, who's here with me today, who was not from El Paso originally, grew up in Chicago and in northern New Mexico, and had just been spending, this was 15 years ago, the previous year in Guatemala, where she was teaching in Guatemala City, was coming through town, and luckily enough for me, my mom and one of Amy's aunts were really good friends, and her Aunt Beth called me up and asked if I'd take Amy out on a date. And I was very happy to do that, and this was in the days pre-Tinder, so you really had to talk to each other and meet each other to figure out who you were and who you were talking to. And like any good El Paso boy, took her over to Ciudad Juarez, to the Kentucky Club, where they dicen, that the margarita was invented. And we had a margarita there at the same bar that I'd love to think that Bob Dylan wrote Tom Thumb's Blues, you know, the song that starts out in the streets of Juarez. Maybe where Johnny Cash bought his drugs that he was busted for in El Paso when he was coming back across. maybe where Elizabeth Taylor drowned her sorrows during her first divorce. She married somebody in the Hilton hotel family and spent their honeymoon in El Paso, Texas, which is, I tell my kids, it'd be like if Beyonce was spending her honeymoon in El Paso today. So all this great history, we're taking it in. We walked down Avenida Juarez to the Customs House, where the first time a president of the United States and the Republic of Mexico ever met, they met there. Neither of them, Taft nor Diaz, needing to have a translator because they both spoke English and Spanish. From there, I'm dropping that knowledge on Amy, and we're walking on to the old Misión de Guadalupe, which has been there for 330 years, and there's this beautiful placita in front of it, and there are musicians playing and people dancing. Elote is being sold and consumed, and we're just sitting on this bench taking it in and taking each other in, and it worked because within a year we're married. A year after that, Ulysses, our oldest, then Molly, and then Henry, all of whom are in school today, going to world-class public schools in El Paso. But I was joking with Amy as I came in. Yeah, let's hear it for world-class public schools in El Paso, New Hampshire, and everywhere. But there was this funny moment not too long after we were married. Amy had chosen to take my name, and I was calling her at work just to check in, and I got her outgoing message, and it said, "You've reached the voicemail of Amy O'Rourke." And I'd like to think 14 years after that, there's no longer a question mark at the end of that. But this visit to New Hampshire is the first one I've been able to make with Amy, and so very grateful that she's here, that she gets a chance to meet you. I've been telling her stories about our travels, our town halls, the lessons learned from meetings just like these. I'm so glad she gets to see it and hear it for herself. And then I also wanted to suggest, and if Amy, if this is okay with you, she'd be happy to answer questions along with me after I have a chance just to introduce ourselves real briefly. So I told you I'm from El Paso. Some of you have been there. Nancy, one of Amy's other aunts, is here right now, also a resident in New Hampshire. Familiar with this, not just our beauty in the Chihuahuan Desert in the Rocky Mountains, but in our people. I mentioned being the largest binational community in the hemisphere. El Paso is, and has been for 20 years running, one of the safest cities in the United States of America. And that is not despite the fact that we are a city of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees, many arriving today. As we're here in New London, they're coming after traveling 2,000 miles, much of that on foot, some of that atop but not inside of a train known as the Beast or La Bestia, to come here just as generations before them for centuries have come to New Hampshire and our home state of Texas, going to the one place they can go where they are fleeing starvation or persecution, or in the case of Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador so often, certain death. But a quarter of those with whom we live were born somewhere else, chose us, and it is their very presence that makes us strong, makes us safe, makes us secure, makes us successful. And it's this profoundly powerful, positive story that we can tell about immigration at this moment. At this defining moment for our country, a country comprised of immigrants and asylum seekers from the world over, who are being asked to choose between fear and paranoia and hatred, exemplified by this person in the highest position of public trust in the land right now, who has described those Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals, though they commit crimes at a far lower rate than those born in this country, has described asylum seekers as an infestation, which is how one might describe a cockroach or something that you want to stamp out or kill, a word maybe used in the Third Reich in the 1930s or 40s, but not used in the United States of America in 2018 and 2019, and yet that's where we are. And these words do not just offend our sensibilities, they lead to the practices and the policies and the actions that will forever define us until we change them. You don't start putting kids in cages, which is what we did to some of these kids who arrived at our border in their most desperate and vulnerable state. You don't deport their moms back to the very countries from which they fled before you've attempted to make them a little bit less human, to make it easier for those who have the job of caging and deporting to be able to do it. You don't get the mosque in Victoria, Texas, in our home state, burned to the ground until you have a president who campaigns on the proposition that Muslims are inherently dangerous and should be banned from the shores of this country, comprised of people from every walk of life and every tradition of faith. That mosque was burned down on the same day that he signed his executive order attempting to stop all Muslim travel to the United States of America in February of 2017. You don't get hate crimes in this country on the rise every year for the last 3 until you have a president who describes Nazis and Klansmen and white supremacists as very fine people. At this moment, this defining moment for our country's future, we need to make sure that we share the stories of who we are and where we are from, this generation and the generations that preceded us. Some can trace their ancestry to the United States of America back 10,000 years. Their ancestors crossed the Bering Straits, settled the lands that we take for granted now. Others were kidnapped in the countries of West Africa, brought here in the holds of slave ships, and literally built the wealth of this country with no prospect or hope of ever enjoying in it or sharing in it or being able to pass it on to their descendants. The O'Rourkes in the 19th century, fleeing a famine that consumed the lives of 1 million more Irish to the one place that would take them in. And in that long tradition are these families arriving today from the Northern Triangle of Central America. We may take some comfort that one man ordered them to be put into cages, ordered their families to be separated, has kept them apart, visiting a cruelty and a torture on those kids that I hope our children can only ever imagine, because I hope that they never experience it. But in this democracy, in this government of, by, and for the people, every single day it persists. It is on every single one of us. And so I try to remind myself and our kids and our family and my community and those that I get a chance to talk to, that unique among the nations of the world and the history of this world, we are defined not by race or by ethnicity or common genealogy. Instead, this idea, first put down on paper 243 years ago, that we are all created equal, with the implication being to equal opportunity, an equal chance to reveal our genius to one another, for this country, and to be the example for the world. If we don't get it right at this moment, I'm afraid that we will lose it forever. And so not only must we make sure that we never again take another child from another mother by force at our front door at the Texas-Mexico border, we must do all within our power, the wealthiest, the most powerful country on the face of the planet, to reunite those families who have been separated already, and then rewrite this country's immigration laws in our own image, to reflect our values, our interests, the reality of our families' stories, and the success of our communities. I'm confident that if we do that, we will make this and every generation that follows proud of the people of 2019 and 2020. We will be able to free dreamers, more than 1 million strong in this country, maybe some attending this very college, free from any fear of deportation back to a country they do not know, whose language they probably no longer speak, where they may not have family, where if we send them there nonetheless and they are successful against those odds, they'll be successful for that place, not this community, not this state, not this country. Free them by making them U.S. citizens in this, their true home country, every bit as American as anyone else. Let's reflect that on paper and ensure that they reach their full potential here for themselves, for their families, and for every single one of us. That should be something that brings this country together in the best traditions of the United States of America. Spending some time in a meeting like this one on our first visit to New Hampshire, and we were talking about healthcare and how hard it is for millions, tens of millions of our fellow Americans to see a doctor or afford a prescription or go to a therapist, or for women in states like mine, not only to access a safe legal abortion, but to get a cervical cancer screening, or see a family planning provider, or see a doctor of any kind, and how it has produced some crises in this country that we're just beginning to focus on. A maternal mortality crisis that claims the lives of women, but African American women, at 3 times the rate of white women in this country. States like mine, where the largest provider of mental health care services is the county jail system. The largest inpatient mental health care facility in a state of 28 million is the Harris County Jail. To the point that people get arrested on purpose to treat their schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression in the one place they are guaranteed to receive the help. Locking them and their potential and whatever they were placed on this planet to do in the first place, whether it's the job they were going to work, the education they were going to complete, the child they were going to raise, the poem that they were going to write, whatever it is, that is locked up with them as well. And the taxpayers in Harris County, home to Houston, Texas, spend $110 a night per inmate who got arrested on purpose for that privilege of just being able to get the care that they need for a fraction of the cost. We could pay for consistent, world-class outpatient mental health care services, free them to do everything they were supposed to do in their lives now well enough to do it. And as I was telling that story at that town hall in New Hampshire, there was a mental health care specialist in the room with us, and he said, I just treated a guy who threw a chair through a window like this one to get arrested so that he could come into my office and get the care and the help that he needed. And before I could respond, a woman slid across a receipt for her prescription medication, and she says, this is so incredibly expensive for me to fill, and I have insurance, and this is with the copay, and it's more than $10,000 a year. And so I take a fraction of the prescribed medication every day to see if I can ration it out so that it will last long enough for me, hopefully, to live and then still be able to afford to put food on the table. This country does not lack for resources. We only want for the political will to bring us all together and to meet these challenges, and to do so for a fraction of the cost that we spend on care today in jails, in emergency rooms, in lives led, diminished, and lives cut short altogether. Universal, guaranteed, high quality care, which means that everyone sees a provider, everyone can afford their medications, no one has to get arrested to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist to get care for the problems that they have, and that every woman has access to the care that they need to make their own decisions about their own bodies. We could do that if we decided to. This deeply divided, highly polarized country coming together to make sure that everyone is well enough to live to their full potential. We're also hearing far too often from those who are working too many jobs to be able to get by. To be able to get by without something being sacrificed in the process. We were asked at the previous town hall today, what do we think about preschool education? And should we make it universal? Absolutely. Spare no expense to make sure that every child receives an education as early as possible. Their lifelong learning outcomes so much better. Their earning potential so much greater. Again, being able to live to your full promise, we can make that investment and make it possible. And for every dollar we put into preschool, we get $9 back as an economy. But the question also prompted us to think about why some kids at the first day of kindergarten are already 10 months back in reading comprehension. You're 4 or 5 years old. How could you be that far behind already? You haven't lived that many 10 months in a row. And yet they're most likely the children of parents who do not have the luxury of reading to their kids before the first day of kindergarten, because they're on that second or that third shift, working for $7.25 an hour in some states without paid family leave. In the case of too many women, earning a fraction of the dollar that men make for the same job, the same value, the same number of hours. In fact, in 2019, 80 cents on the dollar is what's paid to women in this country. And if you're African American, 61 cents on the dollar. Latinas, 53 cents on the dollar. The inability to afford health care or child care or to take time off to be able to take care of yourself or your kids or your parents, and the open tolerance of discrimination in the workplace is holding families, and by extension their communities, and by extension this country and our economy back. What is the answer to this? We've got to have a floor on our minimum wage that is livable. So $15 an hour, regardless of where you are. We must not only wage that fight, we must win it. We've got to have paid family leave. And I know that we suffered a setback in this state, despite the heroic efforts of Representative Abel and others who ensured that we passed it in both chambers, only to see it vetoed by this governor. But we must persist and not give up and extend that idea not just here in New Hampshire, but across the country. And to this challenge of discrimination based on gender, the work was begun long before I entered politics, but it must be finished in the next administration. Ratify the Equal Rights Amendment so that there's no question about the equal value that women provide in every single facet of our lives and the equal treatment that they should receive as a result. Let's make sure, and you understand this in New Hampshire better than anyone else in the country, and perhaps here at this institution, that college must be affordable. You have the highest rates of student loan indebtedness in the United States of America, and across the country it totals $1.5 trillion today, with a default rate approaching 10%. So we understand that this is crushing to people who cannot bear the burden that averages $40,000 per graduating senior today, some tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars more. How do we meet that challenge? We make sure that community college is free so that every American can better themselves at least to an associate's degree. We refinance outstanding student loan debt at the lowest possible rates and greatly expand the public service loan forgiveness program. If you're willing to teach school or to serve as a counselor or a librarian or a therapist in public education, if you will take one of the unfilled jobs in the VA, and we count 45,000 unfilled but funded clinical positions right now, that means wait times for veterans who served this country, put their lives on the line for us, that are measured not in minutes or hours, but months and years. Let's wipe clean your debt so that you can focus on those kids in the classroom, on those veterans who have served this country. Let's make sure that you can do what you were put on this planet to do in the first place and be able to afford it. But then let's also pair that with an elevation of the power of unions in this country, the ability to learn a skill or a trade that will afford you the ability to command a living wage for the rest of your life, ensure that you're equipped with the purpose and the function and the dignity of work that is meaningful and meets the labor demands that we have in this state and around the country. I was told that last year there were 12,000 surplus jobs in the state of New Hampshire, skilled, high value, high wage, without the trained workforce to be able to meet them. Community college, higher education, and unions can help us bridge the gap. It will require an investment, but I want to make sure that we make it. Last issue that I want to leave you with, and the most important one that we can talk about. We now know beyond the shadow of a doubt that this planet has warmed 1 degree Celsius just since the year 1980 over pre-industrial revolution levels. And so what that means is, having just left Iowa and the town of Pacific Junction, every home within it which had been underwater, everything inside those homes destroyed for those owners forever. A town that in its entire history had never flooded. A town along the banks of the Missouri which saw 4 times the normal runoff into the Missouri River Basin, the greatest runoff into that river since we've been keeping records about the Missouri River. And at the same time that we're in Pacific Junction, we're reading about on the other side of the state, against the banks of the Mississippi in Davenport, the highest flood levels in that city in recorded history, breaking the record set in 1993, the 58 inches of rain that fell from the sky during Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas, the landfall record from a single storm in recorded history in North America, the wildfires in California preceded by the droughts in California that made those trees food for the beetles, the invasive species that turned them into the tinder for the fires that those first responders so heroically fought, and too many were succumbed to in those fires, claiming not just property, but human life. These are not acts of God or Mother Nature. These are the consequences of human action. Our emissions, our excesses, our inaction in the face of the facts and the science and the truth. Those scientists who tell us this and that we are on a trajectory to see damage exponentially worse than anything that I've just described unless we change course, tell us that there are 10 years left for us within which to act, to take bold, urgent action like that we proposed last week, that asked that we invest $5 trillion over the next 10 years to ensure that we have the next generation of renewable energy technologies to free ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels, that we ask rural communities and farmers to take the lead on planting cover crops and keeping more land in conservation to pull more carbon out of the air, sequester it into the ground, to use the latest technologies like no-till farming or precision-till farming to disturb less of the carbon that is already there, and to make investments in those communities that are on the front lines of climate change and disproportionately bear the burden of responding to it. I want to make sure that at this defining moment, all of us do all that we can to make sure that we answer the questions our kids and grandkids are sure to ask of us down the road. When you knew this was happening, when you had every single resource before you as the wealthiest, most powerful, most technologically advanced country on the face of the planet, what did you do? And I'm confident that if we do everything and retake our rightful role as the indispensable nation, convene the other powers of the planet to do their part as well, we can forestall or prevent the absolute worst of what awaits our kids and grandkids. But it will take all of us, and it cannot be done by half steps or half measures or by only half the country. Not one candidate, not one president, not one political party, but every single one of us answering that call. At this deeply divided, highly polarized moment, we are running a campaign to try to bring this country together around these common challenges that I've described today. And I'll close with this. We know this is possible because in Texas, in this campaign that we just ran, in a state thought to be so reliably red that Democrats had feared to tread for most of my adult life, a state that had ranked 50th in voter turnout, not because we love our democracy less than you do here in New Hampshire, but because we were drawn that way based on your race or ethnicity, you'd be drawn out of a congressional district and a reason to vote and an opportunity to have your voice heard by going to every one of the 254 counties, no matter how blue or urban, showing up and not taking you for granted, no matter how small and red and rural, showing up and not writing you off, showing up in every single instance with a willingness to listen and learn, but also to come with the courage of our convictions. We help to be part of a movement that changed democracy and the very functioning of our state in elected office and elected life. We're no longer 50th in the country in turnout. In fact, we saw turnout levels that approached a presidential year. Young voter turnout up 500% over the previous midterm. We won independence for the first time in a decade, won more votes than any Democratic candidate in the state of Texas's history. We helped 2 new members of Congress, both Democrats, win seats long held by Republicans, helping to flip the House of Representatives, change the composition of our state legislature, and aided in the election of 17 African-American women to judicial positions in Houston, literally changing the face of criminal justice in our most diverse city in the United States. And without trimming our sails on a very bold, progressive agenda, 500,000 Republicans who voted for one of the most Republican Tea Party, Trump-loving governors in the country, Greg Abbott, on that same ballot also voted for us. And the kicker is, my mom, a lifelong Republican, was one of them, voted for us in this last election. We know that if we show up for everyone and bring everyone into the solutions and defy the differences that would otherwise divide us, we can do the near impossible. That's what's brought me here today. That's why I'm on the trail with Amy. I hope that is what has brought you out as well. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, listening to you, learning from you, and beginning the conversation. Thank you all for having us out. Very grateful. Appreciate it. Gracias. There we go.
Hi, I'm Maureen Strawn, and I've had a long career in healthcare. And I find myself being appalled by the cost of prescription drugs, as you mentioned. And I just wondered if you had any ideas of how we could address this when you're elected president.
The more I learn, the more I find that all this stuff is connected. The big surprise when I was elected to the Congress in 2012 and took my seat in 2013 was just how nice everyone was that I worked with. From a distance, they're all bums, and it's the only way to explain the dysfunction of Congress, the corruption that's been institutionalized, and yet they were much like me and Amy, had campaigned hard, wanted to serve their constituents, were on a mission to do those things that they had committed to on the trail. What explains the disconnect between those fine public servants that I met and the outcomes or lack of outcomes in Congress? It was a second big surprise, which my first full day of orientation after I was sworn in was not in how a bill becomes a law or how you gain the subject matter expertise on your committee's area of jurisdiction. It was how to raise money to assure your reelection and to defeat members of the other party in the chamber in which you worked who would need to be your partners if you were going to get anything done. And literally, they proscribed that half of our day should be on the phone to those who could donate, including those who had business before our committees of jurisdiction. Some have called this legalized corruption or bribery, and in some way it is, and I blame not the members of Congress who were elected into this system, who are doing their best within that to try to deliver for their constituents. But it is on all of us to change it, because otherwise you cannot explain how this country, whose taxpayers have invested in the research and development for the cures and medications that are sold back to us at the highest rates in the world, this country that does not allow you to buy from Canada or the European Union or Mexico, this country that has allowed Purdue Pharma, a pharmaceutical corporation, off the hook, though they sold opioids to doctors and prescribers as some kind of miracle medication without side effects or cause for concern about addiction, though we know that they use something else. This country does not use its leverage or purchasing power, though we buy prescription medications for Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, VA, and federally insured employees, all those beneficiaries, all that leverage, all those billions of dollars. The only way to explain it is the campaign donations, the political action committees, the influence that is bought and paid for on Capitol Hill. So what's the answer to that? This campaign does not accept a dime from any political action committee, no special interests, no corporations, no lobbyists. I don't ever want there to be a real or perceived conflict of interest. I only represent and work with real human beings, my fellow Americans. And together we're going to make sure that we bring down the cost of prescription medication, allow Medicare to use its purchasing power as leverage to drive that down, allow you to buy from Canada if you can't get it here at a decent price, and make sure that when we're talking about universal health care, that we're also talking about guaranteed health care. Much like that woman whose medication costs $10,000 a year, and that's the copay after insurance has kicked in. There are far too many Americans who cannot afford the insurance that they have. We must guarantee their care, and the proposal that we've made, Medicare for America, that enrolls everybody in Medicare who does not have insurance today, enrolls those who have insufficient insurance into the program, and allows those who have employer-sponsored insurance that they like because it works for them and their families to keep it, is the surest, quickest way to get there. Thanks for the question. I'm going to go to Cynthia's got the microphone.
Welcome to New Hampshire.
Thank you.
My name is Jim Bays. We moved here 3 years ago from Denton, Texas, so that we could have a vote that counted.
Yes.
What do you think about the way in which the Attorney General has functioned in the context of the Mueller investigation?
This one is a real test for us. You have a foreign power that invaded our democracy and our elections in 2016. That is now beyond the shadow of a doubt as well, especially after the release of the Mueller report. You have underlying facts and evidence that have not been shared with the co-equal branch of government so that we can fully understand what happened and prevent it from occurring again. You have that compounded by a president who has yet to acknowledge that that took place. And in fact, one of his first phone calls after the release of the Mueller report was to none other than Vladimir Putin, with whom he spent an hour on the phone and to whom he declared the entire investigation to be a hoax, sending the green light to him to continue to interfere in the world's greatest democracy in 2020 and going forward. A president who fired the principal investigator into what happened, James Comey, and then tweeted to his previous Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, to end the Russia investigation altogether, and has now declared that he will refuse to honor any subpoena issued from Congress so that we can get to the facts, the consequences, the accountability, and the justice. And without those four things, we are no longer a nation of laws. We have now said that one person, because of the position of public trust and power that he holds, is above the law. That person and his administration, including Attorney General Barr, cannot be exempted from justice, cannot be exempted from our democracy that requires the checks and balances that Congress is trying to assert. My reading of this, now that Barr has refused to testify, has been held in contempt by the Judiciary Committee, is refusing to honor any of the subpoenas that have been issued, is that we can take this to the courts, where it may very well languish for years. The last contempt charge against the sitting Attorney General, Eric Holder, levied in 2012, was just settled through the courts in 2019. We don't have 7 or 8 years to wait to find out what happened to our democracy and to protect us going forward. Impeachment, which affords the Congress the necessary investigative tools and powers to get all those facts and to follow them as high as they go, as far as they reach, should be the last possible option. And I think we have reached that last possible option right now. It's the only way to get that accountability and to get that justice. And so I don't say this lightly, and this must be a very sober, deliberate path that we take as a country. It should be beyond party and partisanship and politics. But if we fail to do that, we could very well lose this democracy and this country going forward. Thanks for asking the question.
Here, the steps a little bit more up.
Lots of steps.
Over here,
Where are
sorry,
you?
behind you. There we go.
Thanks.
I'm Wade Rainey, and I'm a student at Lebanon High School, and I'm supposed to be homesick right now, so don't tell me Matthew. But
Cut the live stream.
but even as someone who comes from a stable household with 2 incomes and a sibling who's likely going to earn an athletic scholarship, paying for college is still a really big concern. So I was just wondering if you could go into more detail on how you're going to lower costs for university.
Yeah. So to expand a little bit on what I said earlier, community college, the ability to earn an associate's degree, should be a given for every single American. We're seeing in El Paso, and you may have this in New Hampshire as well, early college high schools where at 18 years old you walk across that stage and receive your high school diploma, but also get an associate's degree. And we're seeing this in all parts of the country. In rural Roscoe, Texas, 90% of high school seniors are graduating with an associate's degree, many of them with a remote FAA pilot's license that allows them to fly the drones that do the maintenance inspections on the wind turbines that dominate the horizon in that community. Real jobs that provide purpose and function, high skill, high wage. It's a great investment, and it doesn't come cheap, but it produces a return. Those young people, as they grow older, will be able to command a living wage for the rest of their lives. If we add to that those older Americans, perhaps parents who have raised their kids at home and are now joining the workforce or rejoining, or those whose jobs have been automated out of existence, community colleges provide perhaps the best value to retrain and reskill and to learn those trades and professions that allow them as well to reach their full potential. But I want to make sure that we also pair this with an opportunity to expand the power and the reach of unions. Visiting with the carpenters in Michigan not too long ago, they have a 4-year program. The apprentices within it will not take on a dime of debt and will be able to earn at a very high level for jobs that we cannot fill today because we do not have the skilled and trained workforce that we need, a problem that we have here in New Hampshire. For those who are paying back part of that $1.5 trillion an outstanding student loan debt. We got to make sure that we are there for them as well. Refinance that at the lowest possible rates. I think I saw something that over the next 10 years, the federal government stands to make over $8 billion on the interest payments paid by former students. We shouldn't be making money off of those who have worked to improve themselves so they can improve this country. So lower those interest rates. And then, as I mentioned earlier, let's vastly expand the public service student loan forgiveness program. So if you're willing to come back to an in-demand profession in an underserved community anywhere in America, it could be your hometown, let's make that easier and affordable for you by lifting some or all that burden off your back, especially if that career is connected to some form of public service. And I gave two examples earlier. It could be serving in public education, could be serving in the VA, could be in a conservation corps, clearing trails or helping to move some of that tinder out of those forests in California. But whatever it is, as long as it adds value and there's a public benefit, then I think it is appropriate for us to make a public investment. So those are some approaches that I would take on making it affordable. Thanks for asking. Appreciate it. Thanks for missing school today, too.
Behind you, Beto, behind you.
Thank you.
My name is Joe Cubitt from the London. Thank you for coming today. I am an undeclared independent voter. I have a choice of which primary to vote in February. There are 21 Democrats running in the Democratic primary. Why you? Why should I vote for you among all the Democrats?
Thank you for being here, and thanks for asking the question. And I'm getting used to these kinds of questions in New Hampshire. Folks who say, I've seen you 3 or 4 times, maybe on the 6th or 7th, I'll be able to tell you how I feel about you. Let me just acknowledge the obvious. We have the chance to run in an extraordinary field. Such diversity in background and life experience and skills and expertise that all these candidates bring to the challenges that we've described here today. That's a really good sign, not just for the Democratic Party, but for the vitality of our democracy and the commitment to public service that we now have. Some things that might be unique about me. More than 20 years ago, with some good friends in El Paso, I started a small business, a technology firm, high skill, high value, high wage jobs in one of the poorest urban counties in the United States of America, recognizing there was so much talent there that just needed to be connected to an opportunity. Fortunate to be part of a great team there. Served on the El Paso City Council, nonpartisan elected position, neither as a Democrat nor as a Republican, just as an El Pasoan delivering for my constituents. Ran a race against the incumbent and against the odds to serve in Congress. And every single day of those 6 years, sitting next to Annie Custer on the House Veterans Affairs Committee in the minority, having to deliver for our constituents and those veterans at a time of an epidemic in suicide. 20 a day is the conservative estimate, with the majority of those who've lost their lives being unwilling or unable to get into a VA and receive the care that they needed. Annie always pushing New Hampshire and the need for those, especially in rural and hard-to-reach communities, to get the care that they needed. In El Paso, we were focused on mental health care access. We had the longest wait times to see a mental health care provider in the country. And the only way to make that better was to find enough common ground with my Republican colleagues who were in the majority to get it done. And we did. As we did when we protected public lands in El Paso or invested in our ports of entry. We didn't allow partisanship. We didn't allow the differences to define us. We found out how to get it done because I feared my constituents before whom I appeared every single month at meetings like these, open to all, and wanted them to know that I was going to do everything in my power to deliver for them. And then I mentioned this campaign that we ran across the state of Texas, talking about gun violence and universal background checks and banning the sale of assault weapons and ensuring that we move forward on red flag laws, talking about health care, not just in primary and mental health care, but in a state that has shut down a quarter of its family planning clinics, talking about the consequence that means in maternal mortality, and standing up for every woman being able to make her own decisions about her own body, and in the process, being part of an election that changed the electorate in Texas. We are now in play. We have a seat at the table because we were able to bring everybody out because we went to everyone in the first place. To the reddest counties, not in the state of Texas, but in the United States of America. You can see them glowing from outer space as you orbit planet Earth. These are places that in some cases voted for Donald Trump 96% in the last election. But we showed up because they're every bit as deserving of being heard, of being listened to, of being fought for, of being served. And in so many instances, we were able to win their votes by not writing them off and including them in the solutions to the challenges that we had described. That's the way that I've served. That's the way that I campaign. That's the way that I'm here before you today. And that's the way that I'd love to serve you as President of the United States. So a little bit about me for the answer to your question. Thanks.
Behind you again, all the way in the back of the room.
Great.
Hi. Hello? Yep, there we are. Hi, my name is Sue McKevin. I'm from Bradford, New Hampshire, originally New York, and that's the accent. Been here for over 40 years. First of all, I'd like to extend to you a contribution that a very fine massage therapist is offering you if you are in so need.
Is that transferable to my spouse?
Absolutely,
Yeah, okay. Amy?
absolutely. So
Thank you.
talk to me later. I actually have two foreign policy questions for you.
Great.
One is, and I have to read them because I get nervous. One is, what is your plan to normalize relations with Cuba by ending the blockade and giving them back Guantanamo?
Yeah.
That's the first one.
Okay.
Do
You want me to take them? Why don't you ask me the second one,
Okay.
and if they're related, I may be able to weave them together.
Well, it's still foreign. And what are your plans to both stop and dismantle the settlements in the occupied territories and guarantee Palestinians' rights to live? And this is not about Israel's right to live. We're talking about the Palestinians. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. So I, at the outset, was talking about where Amy and I are from, and these border communities that are receiving asylum seekers who've traveled these 2,000 miles, including a story you may have seen a couple of weeks ago of a 3-year-old boy alone in a cornfield just outside of Brownsville, Texas, with a phone number written in permanent marker on his shoe. A level of desperation that we can only imagine produces a journey like that one. If we look at our history in the Americas, and this is to your question on Cuba, Guatemala, where Amy had just been teaching before she came to El Paso, in 1954, the CIA led a coup against a democratically elected president, Jacob Arbenz Guzman. The people of Guatemala chose him. He wasn't good for the United Fruit Company, for the United States, for the Dulles brothers, and so we took him out. And in the decades that followed, you saw such a destabilization in Guatemala that is not unconnected to those families who are coming here today. We go to Nicaragua and El Salvador, the civil wars we involved ourselves in the 1970s and the 1980s, the half-life for the consequences of our foreign intervention, we're still feeling in El Paso and Brownsville and perhaps here in New London. The drug wars that we fight, not just here at home, that's produced the largest prison population on the face of the planet, disproportionately comprised of people of color, but the drug wars we foist on the people of this hemisphere that have hollowed out their institutions and civil society and rule of law. I'm making the case that when we use military, when we intervene by force, when we try to impose our solutions on other sovereign countries, the results have not been good for them, and they have not been good for us. And so Cuba, what is it now? 60 years plus after the Bay of Pigs. And ever since trying to use intimidation, a very strong power that we have, to force a change in government there. And the Castro brothers have outlived every administration that has followed. And the Obama administration tried to do what had been obvious, it sounds like, to you and to me and to others, to acknowledge that this strategy was not working. It was not changing their form of government. It was not good for the people in this country, nor was it good for the people in that country. But that opening has now been closed by this administration and this president. So yes, I would stop the embargo. I would try to normalize our relationships with Cuba. I'd make sure that we talk about every dynamic of that relationship, from trade to travel to our ownership of part of that country. So I think That's the right path for us to take. When it comes to Israel and Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza, look, to state the obvious, this is a tough one. And no one before me has quite figured it out, perhaps because, in the same spirit as the last answer, we must have the humility to acknowledge that we can't figure this out for somebody else. We cannot impose this, no matter how powerful, no matter how strong, no matter how much foreign aid we send to the people of Palestine and to the people of Israel. Ultimately, it's going to be up to them to decide the solution. My opinion is the only long-term prospect for peace and treating the people of the region, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, with dignity and respect in their lives and ensuring that they are safe from attack, is a two-state solution. But as we know now, there are leaders on both sides, and Mahmoud Abbas, who has no real ability to rein in the worst elements, including those who are firing rockets from Gaza into Israel against defenseless citizens. No hope or prospect with his leadership to have someone at the table with whom the Israelis can negotiate. And on Israel's side, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's openly avowed racist policies, side with racist parties, has talked about annexing the West Bank, which not only forever spikes any possibility of a two-state solution, it also ruins the opportunity for Israel to be both a democracy and a Jewish country. It will now have to choose to be one or the other. We need real leaders on both sides who can come to the table, and whatever influence we can use with the appropriate humility to help them get to that table and to make that decision. I want to make sure that we are providing that in that region. So thanks for two important questions. Appreciate that.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you for coming today. My name is Sarah DiRuda. Okay, woohoo, closer.
Yeah.
So my name is Sarah DiRuda. I am a graduating senior, graduating tomorrow from this institution.
All right. Congratulations.
As a senior, of course, we do senior projects, and but beyond a senior project, this past summer I traveled to Greece to work a month and a half as an emergency first responder with refugees and asylum seekers. In Greece, on Lesbos Island, if you guys are not quite sure where Lesbos is, it's in Greece, and it's currently named by the United Nations the worst refugee camp in the world. And you speak a lot about being able to bring more refugees in here, whether they be from the Middle East or from South America or anywhere. And it's kind of a two-parted question. So the conditions that refugees and asylum seekers face already in different countries is mortifying. The corruption that's been created with not just governmental powers, but volunteer groups, military, and it all influences the protection and the flow of human beings. And so my two-part question to you is, how do you plan to kind of resettle refugees here in the U.S. in a sustainable way? But also, do you have any ideas or polls as to how you would like to strengthen our foreign relations and really kind of mark down this bias that we have created about people from different cultures, and not just work for the United States and refugee resettlement, but to work for a whole world of resettlement with refugees? Because you say too that the United States has this power, and I firmly believe it, and I think that if you become president, Mr. President, I hope you like the sound of that if it happens, what you might do, not to just work for the people of the United States, but the people of the world.
Yeah. Wow, what a thoughtful question. Thank you. And thanks for your work for refugees. A couple thoughts on this. Our current president has talked about meeting those refugees and asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle with this 2,000-mile wall. He's met them with cages. He's met them with fenced-in pens in my hometown of El Paso, literally constructed overnight underneath the international bridge that connects us with Juarez, with Chihuahua, with Mexico. And it's not only adult men, it's women, and it's their little kids in this dirt behind cyclone fencing and barbed wire in the United States of America. And though 400,000, which is the number of apprehensions we saw last year, sounds like a lot, to put it in perspective, the second year of the George W. Bush administration, we saw 1.6 million apprehensions. So there is a crisis for those families. There is a crisis in those countries. There's not a crisis here in the United States, nor is there on our border. The best way to meet this challenge is obviously not with the cages, not with the fence, not with the wall, but to go to the Northern Triangle countries themselves, work with local communities, and in some cases beyond the government, and perhaps to be as effective as possible beyond some of those governments, to reduce violence, to improve the likelihood that those communities can stabilize, and that no mother has to envision sending her 3-year-old boy on a 2,000-mile journey in the hands of these coyotes or smugglers, as she now is forced to do. We are spending only $500 million in those 3 countries of the Northern Triangle today. President Trump wants to zero that out as punishment to them, knowing, well, I shouldn't assume anything on his part, but that will not make it better. That will exacerbate the problem. There will be more coming north if he does that. If instead we double the amount, and to put it in perspective, $1 billion is 1/30 of what he wants to spend on the wall. We have seen when we make those investments intelligently that they actually reduce violence and more families are able to stay there. In Syria, we know that civil war was preceded by the worst drought seen in that country's long history. We also know that it was made worse by our invasion of Iraq in 2003, destabilizing that entire region. Some of our challenges with Iran today are connected to that. In Yemen, where we are in the midst of what will be the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, not only do we stand by as Saudi Arabia, whom we have armed and equipped, bombs innocent civilians, hospitals, and schools, we're also a co-combatant in that war, providing guidance and technology and fighting right alongside them, whether or not we want to admit it to ourselves. That is exactly what we are doing. So I'm making the case to you that first and foremost, let's stop creating refugees, whether it is climate, whether it is our wars, whether it is our interventions around the world. We have a chance to make things better in those countries, not worse. Second, you probably know this better than anyone, but refugees are the most vetted population on this planet for settlement. So before they're able to come to the United States, they're vetted by the UN, then they're vetted by the United States of America through many different agencies and departments before they're then able to settle in El Paso or New London or Austin or wherever. We also know that the ultimate beneficiary of settling refugees in this country is not the refugee or her family, it is the United States of America. Whatever they're going to do over the course of their lives, they're now going to do it here, and we get to benefit from that. As you know, the Trump administration has set the lowest cap on the number of refugees we resettle, despite some of the greatest humanitarian disasters in the world today. This is part of our heritage, part of our responsibility, and certainly an opportunity into the future to accept more of those refugees into this country. So I want us to do both. I want us to address the problems at their root, and I also want, as long as those problems continue, to settle refugees in this country. It's the right thing to do, and it is to our lasting benefit. Thanks for asking the question. For the work that
He answered it? Oh, well, go ahead, Wonky.
Well, thank you very much for this romp through all of our goals as citizens here. This is unfortunately a little wonky. You raised the issue of campaign finance reform is so essential to the corporatization of American medicine, among other things.
Yeah.
And you raised your thoughts about Medicare for America.
Correct.
As one public option, apparently, that would be added to the ACA, which is, of course, under threat, CHIP, Medicaid, Medicare, VA, Indian Health Service, etc. It's one more insertion of a program to cover those whom our current medical system does not cover.
Right.
Since the privatization and profiteering of the medical insurance industry from the 1980s, as you pointed out, and I appreciate, we've seen our healthcare outcomes trail the rest of the industrialized world at twice the cost.
Right.
So yeah, folks are barely able to afford their premiums, may like their health insurance, but in addition to inserting one more new mechanism, do you have other thoughts about looking at the medical industry, the medical insurance industry, in terms of asking them to stop their cherry picking, they're lemon dropping of patients who have medical illness. How do you look at the global issue?
Yeah. In much the same way that we talked about pharmaceutical corporations and the impunity with which they can act and price Americans, in some cases, out of their lives. Insulin developed 97 years ago in Canada, sold to the Canadian government for $3 Canadian. No hope for profit, just trying to save the lives of their fellow human beings. And we've seen the price of insulin in this country jacked through the roof, so that in some cases nurses who are administering this to their patients are unable to afford it themselves and are rationing it, and we're losing people to diabetes in the year 2019. Those insurance companies, which for so long, really until the Obama administration and the leadership of Nancy Pelosi and those brave members of the Senate and House who voted for it, some to their political peril, ended their careers, we're dropping people who are too expensive to care for. We're denying coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. So strengthening those protections, one in the ACA, that are under attack right now, unlike any other time, is critically important. But if all we do is play defense, I'm afraid we've set ourselves up for the next loss. That's why we're asking that we join forces for an incredibly bold expansion of healthcare, primarily through one of the most popular, most effective, and one of the most cost-effective programs. I believe, and you'll know perhaps better than I do, the overhead administrative cost for Medicare is like 2 or 3%. For private insurance companies, it's like 15 or 16% for everything they have to spend on advertising and the corporate suites and the lobbying members of Congress to get outcomes to their favor. So if we strengthen Medicare, enroll tens of millions of new Americans into that program, allow those who are insufficiently insured to move over as well, that begins to become the insurer and payer of choice, especially if we buck up that program so that the reimbursement rates are such that providers want to be members or be within those networks for Medicare. But it also acknowledges those tens of millions of Americans who do have employer-sponsored insurance, or those members of unions who fought for plans. They said, I was meeting with the culinary workers in Las Vegas, 60,000 members, and they said, look, we fought for this level of health care and insurance. We took lower pay as a result. We want to keep these plans that we fought for. So for me, this is the best of all possible outcomes, to get there as quickly as possible and not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. So thanks for the question. Estolo Cano, New London, thank you very much for having us out here today. Always sorry, we're grateful. We look forward to seeing you again, and you're always welcome to join us in El Paso. Thank you. Bye-bye.